The time is now for the Dr. Bob Sports Podcast. I am Tanner. I am our head of analytics. And for the past 6 seasons, I have been working alongside Bob, originating our NFL and college basketball bets. And today I am joined, as always, by our digital media specialist, Grant. How we doing?
Doing good, Tan. Happy Friday, everybody. The preseason has finally kicked off, but when we're looking at your background there, you're not at home. What's going on?
No. Today I'm recording from the shores of Lake Winnipesaukee in beautiful New Hampshire. Happy to be out here getting a couple of last trips in before the grind of the NFL and college basketball season start.
Yeah, what a spot. But all right, let's dive straight into this NFC East episode. So, the first team we're going to talk about is the Philadelphia Eagles. So, the Eagles win total is set at 10.5 after going 14-3 and finishing 5th in weighted DVOA. The Eagles came flying out of the gates last year as they were 8-0 before they would get their first loss of the season. The team would quickly get back on their winning ways as they won 5 straight, but a Jalen Hurts injury would put him out weeks 16 and 17, which both those games ended up being losses. They beat the Giants in Week 18 and then again in the divisional round. And then they went on to beat the 49ers in the NFC Championship game. But the Eagles were able to put up 35 points in the Super Bowl, but would fall 3 points shy of the Chiefs. How was this offense able to find so much success last year?
Well, the Eagles were the only offense in the regular season to have a rush success rate above 50%. And that's mainly due to that strong offensive line and opponents having to account for the legs of Jalen Hurts. Now, I don't think the ground game is going to miss a beat after losing Miles Sanders in the offseason because they brought in Rashad Penny, who just by the metrics has been pretty incredible. Penny leads the NFL in rushing yards over expected per carry and EPA per carry during the past 2 seasons. And they also added DeAndre Swift, who certainly has some elusiveness to his game as well. That said, Philadelphia's offense did have more run plays than pass plays last season, but that was a consequence of the Eagles' leads that they built throughout the year. Philadelphia's pass rate in neutral situations was 55%, which was 5th highest in the league. And Philadelphia's offense will likely run more plays this season because the Eagles snapped the ball 2 seconds quicker when the game was within 6 points last year than they did when leading by a touchdown or more. So I expect the Eagles to have more dropbacks this year for Hurts and just more plays overall because they won't be playing such a soft schedule.
Yeah, and we saw that trade for AJB clearly worked out early in the year. I mean, the whole year, sorry. But should we expect the same production this year from the pass catchers?
Yeah, well, this receiving group led by A.J. Brown, as you mentioned, Devonta Smith, and actually tight end Dallas Goedert led the NFL in EPA per target last year. So I would say this group is right up there with San Francisco for best receiving core in the NFL.
Yeah, and do you think this is still going to be one of the best O-lines in the league, even with the loss of Isaac Seumalo?
Yeah, well, Philadelphia's offensive line is probably the most talented in the league. It's interesting because Hurts still had a 7.6% sack rate last year, which ranked 24th, but that was actually mostly on Hurts. Can't really blame the offensive line. Hurts was responsible for 26% of the pressures against him, ranking 40th out of 43 qualifying quarterbacks. So if Hurts can get the ball out a little bit quicker, this offensive line would look even better. Now, from a talent standpoint, they probably get a little bit worse because, like you said, they lose Seumalo, who ranked 10th in pass blocking efficiency last year, and they replaced him with a 3rd-round rookie. So I would say the talent on the offensive line gets a little bit worse, but maybe they can make up for it just with Hurts getting the ball out a little bit faster.
Yeah, and do you think Brian Johnson's going to be able to fill the shoes of Shane Steichen at OC?
And so he was the former quarterback coach, and he was promoted to offensive coordinator. And he's credited with a lot of the development that we've seen from Hurts. But I think it's unlikely to match the play calling prowess we saw from Shane Steichen, who's one of the best offensive play callers in the NFL. So Brian Johnson could still be an above average play caller, but I still think it is a downgrade at offensive coordinator just because Steichen is now out the door as the head coach of the Indianapolis Colts.
Yeah, and we saw this defensive line just mauling QBs last year. What made them so successful?
Yeah, well, Philadelphia's defense had 70 sacks last season to lead the league, and it was third most in NFL history, with the caveat that they had a 17th game to do it. But even so, the Eagles averaged nearly a full sack more than the second rated Patriots, and Philadelphia's defense had four players with at least 11 sacks. And rotation was critical for the Eagles up front, with seven defensive linemen having 200 pass rushing snaps last year. And Philadelphia's pass rush also came at you from both directions. They had a balanced 52% of the pressures come from the right side and 48% come from the left side. Now, they lose an important piece with Javon Hargrave going to San Francisco. Hargrave ranked second among interior defenders in pass rushing efficiency, and the Eagles will be expecting last year's first-round pick Jordan Davis and this year's first-round pick Jalen Carter to step in for Hargrave.
Yeah, and those two guys are going to need to help in with this rush defense, right?
Yeah. I mean, the Eagles allowed a league high 48% rush success rate through the first 10 weeks of 2022, and they realized that that was not sustainable. And so they signed Ndamukong Suh and Linval Joseph in the middle of last year, and the Eagles conceded just a 38% rush success rate the final 8 games of the season, which ranked 10th. So they went from last to 10th, bringing in those big body free agents in the middle of last year, but they didn't bring either Suh or Joseph back. So it's another reason, like you said, that they'll need those young guys on the interior to step up.
Yeah, and do you think they did enough to replace TJ Edwards and CJ Gardner Johnson?
Yeah, well, Edwards finished second in PFF coverage grade among linebackers, and Gardner Johnson finished fourth in PFF coverage grade among safeties. And they replaced those guys with linebacker Nicholas Morrow and safety Terrell Edmonds, which are two clear downgrades in my eyes. Morrow graded as PFF's ninth worst linebacker last year, and opposing quarterbacks had 132 passer rating into Edmonds' coverage in 2022. So those two guys will be a clear drop off from TJ Edwards and CJ Gardner Johnson.
Yeah, and do you think they're going to be affected by the switch at defensive coordinator?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I talked about in the Cardinals preview how I thought Jonathan Gannon got some unfair criticism being the Eagles defensive coordinator these last 2 seasons, but I certainly don't think that Gannon was above average as a defensive play caller. And I think that Sean Desai coming in as the new defensive coordinator is also probably going to be around league average. So I would say I'm much more worried about the loss of offensive coordinator Steichen than defensive coordinator Gannon.
Yeah, so how big of an impact do you think their easy schedule was last year?
It was crazy to see how that all unfolded. So the strength of schedule last year by DVOA was the easiest for a Super Bowl team in the last 15 seasons. And it actually gets even worse once you account for the personnel that was available for the opponents when they played the Eagles. So the Eagles got Cooper Rush for one of the Cowboys games. They got Davis Webb among a myriad of other backups when the Giants were locked into that 6 seed for that regular season finale. Philadelphia also benefited from Pittsburgh without TJ Watt, Houston without its top 2 wide receivers, as well as Green Bay missing its best pass rusher Rashawn Gary and all-pro caliber linebacker Devondre Campbell. So the Eagles only had 3 games against quarterbacks to finish top 10 in EPA per play. Jared Goff's Lions scored 35 points in the season opener. Trevor Lawrence only scored 21 points, but if you remember, that game was a monsoon, and Lawrence lost 4 fumbles. And then Dak Prescott's offense gained 419 yards and scored 40 points on Christmas Eve. So the Eagles will face a roughly average strength of schedule this year rather than one of the worst we've seen in NFL history. But I still think even playing an average schedule, they'll be favored to win the NFC, but the win total certainly will not be as high as we saw in 2022.
All right, well, let's move on to our next team, the Dallas Cowboys. So the Cowboys win total is set at 9.5 after they went 12-5 and finished 7th in weighted DVOA. The Cowboys started their season with a loss to the Bucs and an injury to Dak that would sideline him until Week 7. During this time, Cooper Rush took the team to 4-1 with the help of the likes of Micah Parsons and the rest of this defense really stepping up. The Cowboys went on to win 8 of their last 11 games, and they would get to beat Tom Brady in the final game of his career. This team would then fall short to the 49ers for the second straight year in the playoffs, but the team has since parted ways with offensive coordinator Kellen Moore. How big of an impact is this going to be for them?
Well, I'm not going back and forth on this. I mean, Dak was 0.8 yards per pass play better in the seasons with Kellen Moore calling the plays than he was in the 3 years without him. And the story that made major headlines this offseason after the Cowboys parted ways with Moore was head coach Mike McCarthy hinting that Moore's desire to, quote, light up the scoreboard actually hindered the overall team. And a lot of people interpreted this as the Cowboys are going to run the ball a lot more often, but they already had the ninth highest rushing rate last season. And the offseason moves do not support this idea after not bringing back Zeke and basically having no depth at running back behind Tony Pollard.
Yeah, do you think not bringing back Zeke might help this team?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I'm getting at here is that, if they only have Pollard, it basically forces, because Pollard probably, you can't give him more than 25 carries a game. So it basically forces McCarthy into passing the ball and putting the ball into Dak's hands. And I mean, you could argue that they will have a lower rushing rate. I mean, they finished ninth last season. I don't think it'd be crazy to expect them to finish average in rushing rate this season, even though everyone's all worried about McCarthy saying that he wants to kill games if they have the lead and not try and score as many points as possible.
Yeah, so do you think the losses of Dalton Schultz or Noah Brown will make any impact?
Well, Schultz and Brown were both among the 13 qualifying receivers last year to actually have a negative EPA per target. So I'm not really worried about losing either of those guys. And they bring in Brandon Cooks, who has a career 1.81 yards per route run and is a top 50 receiver to play alongside CeeDee Lamb and a finally healthy Michael Gallup. So I like this receiving trio that the Cowboys have, and I'm not worried about losing Dalton Schultz or Noah Brown.
Yeah, these offensive weapons look pretty loaded, but how's this O line going to be this year?
On paper, this offensive line looks like one of the best in the NFL. Left tackle Tyron Smith has made the Pro Bowl in every season. He started at least 10 games since 2013. Tyler Smith was passable, filling in for Tyrone Smith at left tackle last year when Tyrone was injured. And Tyler should benefit from moving to an easier position now, bumping into guard. Center Tyler Biadasz was one of 6 qualifying centers last year to not allow a sack. Right guard Zach Martin is unhappy about his contract, but I expect him to play, and he's been all-pro 4 of the last 5 seasons. And right tackle Terrence Steele ranked 15th in pass blocking efficiency in 2022, so you could say that he's above average. And so, looking across this offensive line, it looks like some all-pro caliber and the floor is just above average guys. And so we could see this offensive line challenging the Eagles to be the best in the NFL.
All right, let's move it over to the defense. So, how was this secondary last year, and are they going to be improved in 2023?
Well, Dallas was conceding just a 43% dropback success rate through the first 7 weeks of last season, which ranks 7th in the NFL. But that was when the starting secondary was intact. And then they lost Jordan Lewis and kind of scrapped and clawed for the next month and a half, missing only one starter. But they surrendered a 49% success rate the last 5 games of the year without both Lewis and Anthony Brown. And Jordan Lewis is on PUP in training camp recovering from that Liz Frank injury. And Anthony Brown is no longer on the roster. But they did bring in cornerback Stephon Gilmore, who ranked 6th in PFF coverage grade a season ago. So I like Gilmore and Trayvon Diggs, and Dallas will just be hoping that they can get Lewis back as soon as possible because backup nickelback Deron Bland surrendered 0.55 yards per cover snap in the slot more than Lewis did last year. So everyone's healthy, when they've got Lewis playing nickel and then Diggs and Gilmore as boundary cornerbacks, this secondary is very, very strong.
Yeah, and we saw Micah Parsons lead this defense last year, but how good was this pass rush?
Yeah, Micah Parsons finished last season with a league high 90 pressures, and that's despite 64 snaps spent in coverage. And I expect him to be almost exclusively rushing the passer in 2023 alongside DeMarcus Lawrence. And only the 2020 Steelers had a higher pressure rate than last season's Cowboys dating back to 2012. That's 352 defenses since 2012, and the Cowboys ranked 2nd in pressure rate. So this pass rush unit plus scheme from Dan Quinn has been incredible. And Dan Quinn's defenses ranked 7th and 9th in 2 seasons in Dallas so far, according to our metrics. And I think they could even improve on that in 2023.
Yeah, and last year we saw them recover so many fumbles. Is this a category that you worry about them regressing in?
Yeah, I mean, Dallas was able to recover 22 of the 34 fumbles available to them on offense and defense combined in 2022. And fumble recoveries are almost completely random. So to get way more than half like that certainly would be likely to regress in 2023. Now, I'm not worried about Dak Prescott's career high 3.8% interception rate last year. Dak had 20 turnover worthy plays, according to PFF, and 17 interceptions. So, league wide, turnover worthy plays resulted in interceptions 77% of the time, and Prescott's number was 89%. So, they probably won't recover as many fumbles, but Dak won't throw as many interceptions. So, I think those kind of neutralize each other.
Yeah, so if this team stays healthy, do you think they have the defense to make a Super Bowl run, or is this gonna kind of come down to Dak?
Oh, I think the defense is definitely good enough to make a Super Bowl run. It's really just going to come down to making sure that Dak doesn't fall off now without Kellen Moore, because I think this offense has a lot of potential too, bringing in Brandon Cook. So right now, the market has the Eagles 1.5 points better than the Cowboys to start the season, but I think the gap between these two top teams in the NFC East is probably a little bit tighter than that.
All right, so let's move on to the New York Giants. So the Giants' win total is set at 7.5 after they went 9-7-1 and finished 17th in weighted DVOA. The Giants hired head coach Brian Dable for 2022, and they were hoping to progress Daniel Jones similar to how he was able to progress Josh Allen.
Mhm.
This roster that was lacking talent was able to come out scorching hot as they started 6-1. The team sputtered in the second half, but they were still able to make the playoffs and knock off the Vikings in that wild card weekend. But the next week, they would fall short to the Eagles in the divisional round. What'd you take away from the Giants last year?
They were kind of a crazy team because they kept winning ball games, but all the underlying metrics showed that they were very poor. So the Giants finished 30th in net yards per play last season after compensating for strength of schedule. And the market understood that they weren't that bad, but they still had the Giants, the betting markets had the Giants 22nd going into the playoffs, or about 2 points worse than average.
Yeah, and we saw Daniel Jones make progress last season. Should we expect him to build off that again this year?
Well, Jones raised his success rate from 45% in 2021 to 50% last year, led by new coach Brian Dable. But I think it was a lot of smoke and mirrors. Honestly, it was a genius job by the coaching staff not asking too much of their quarterback. Jones had the lowest average depth of target of any qualifying quarterback, and he had the second highest play action rate, giving him, sort of more of those easy throws when the linebackers are getting sucked up because they're worried about Saquon Barkley. So opposing defensive coordinators will now have had an entire offseason to scheme up ways to keep Daniel Jones in the pocket and take away those underneath routes that the Giants had so much success with last year. So he's going to have to prove that he has real arm talent in 2023. And the Giants signed Jones to a 4-year, $160 million deal that they can get out of after the 2024 season. So it seems like sort of a sign of faith, but also even the front office isn't positive that he's the guy.
Yeah, how big of an addition do you think Waller's going to be for him?
Well, it never really clicked for Waller and Josh McDaniels' system last year in Las Vegas, but he did average 2.18 yards per route run from 2019 to 2021. So Waller's clearly still a top 10 tight end in my eyes. And I'd say that Waller is at least a half point better than Daniel Bellinger. So a clear upgrade for this offense. And I've got New York's receiver group up to around league average, with Waller now the focal point alongside Darius Slayton, Isaiah Hodgins, and Sterling Shepard returning from an ACL injury that kept him out most of last season.
Yeah, and it also felt like they got great play from one side of one tackle, but the other tackle struggled last year.
Yeah, it was crazy to see the dichotomy there. So left tackle Andrew Thomas registered just 2 penalties all last season and conceded only 21 pressures on over 600 pass blocking snaps. Meanwhile, right tackle Evan Neal ranked 55th in pass blocking efficiency out of 56 qualifiers. So New York's coaching staff will be hoping that Neal can make a similar leap from year one to year two, as we saw from Thomas, who graded seventh worst on true pass blocking sets according to PFF in 2020, and then was seventh best in the same category just 1 year later in 2021.
Do you think this line's going to miss John Feliciano, or did they do a pretty good job replacing him?
Well, Feliciano wasn't that good last year. He ranked seventh worst among centers in pass blocking efficiency. But other rookie centers last year, like Tyler Linderbaum and Luke Fortner, were worse than Feliciano. So I don't think that the Giants can necessarily say that they got a clear upgrade after drafting John Michael Schmitz in the second round. Meanwhile, Mark Lewinsky and Ben Bredson are clearly below average guards in my mind. So New York's offensive line finished 29th in pass block win rate last year. And if they want to get any better, it's likely going to have to come from former 7th overall pick Evan Neal making that leap we talked about.
Yeah, and moving over to this defense, do you think the signing of Bobby Okereke is going to help?
Well, the Giants ranked 30th in rush EPA allowed in 2022. So Okirike had 31 run stops, ranking 13th among linebackers last year. And so I do think that he plugs a hole that they had at that position, because Okirike is a top 20-ish linebacker in my eyes.
Yeah, what are your thoughts on how the D line played last year?
Well, Dexter Lawrence and Leonard Williams combined for 96 pressures on the interior, which is crazy from just two guys. And they'll be hoping also from a leap from last year's 5th overall pick, Kayvon Thibodeau, on the edge.
Yeah, and we saw them draft rookie Deontay Banks. Is he going to help the secondary this year?
Yeah, I mean, Banks is going to play opposite the solid cornerback Adoree Jackson, but sometimes it can take a little bit of a while for those rookie cornerbacks to settle in. And we know Wink Martingale's system is going to put Banks on an island a lot. I mean, the Giants led the NFL with a 40% blitz rate last year, and no other defense was above 35%. So I do think that Wink is a borderline top 5 defensive play caller in the NFL, but he's certainly going to be asking a ton from his rookie cornerback in 2023.
So overall, when you're looking at this team, do you like where the market has the Giants?
Yeah, well, the Giants really do have one of the best coaching staffs in the NFL. I'd say the Ravens are the only one that are definitively better in my eyes, and Miami is certainly up there in terms of play calling as well. But even with the excellent coaching staff, we talked about how the Giants finished last season 2 points worse than average according to the market, and now we're seeing them rated as exactly an average team based on the 2023 point spread. So I'm not sure they got a full 2 points better with the only key additions in the offseason being Darren Waller and Bobby Okereke, and then obviously getting Shepard back from that ACL. So it's really going to come down to whether their 2 top 10 draft picks from 2022 can play to their potential in Thibodeau and Evan Neal.
Yeah, and I saw an interesting stat from Bill Barnwell. Since 2005, there's only been 3 coaches to switch from OC to head coach and take their team to the playoff in the first year. And if he's able to replicate this in the second year, he would join the likes of McVay, LaFleur, and Sirianni to be the only coaches to go from OC to head coach and bring the team to the playoffs in the first 2 years.
Yeah, I mean, I would say Dable is right in those guys' class in terms of head coaching ability. So it wouldn't surprise me to see it, but in a softer NFC. But yeah, I mean, I just don't know if they added enough this offseason to really make them favorites to make the playoffs.
Let's shift over to the Washington Commanders. So the Commanders' win total is set at 6.5 after going 8-1 and finishing 18th in weighted DVOA. The team traded for Carson Wentz over the offseason, and he went 2-4 before going down with an injury. The team then moved to Taylor Heineke, and he was able to go 5-3-1 during his time as a starter. And then the team introduced Sam Howell to the NFL in the final week of the season, and he was able to get his first career win as a starter. The team has brought in Coach Eric Bieniemy, but is he going to be enough to help kick off Sam Howell's career?
Well, the Commanders only gave Sam Howell 22 dropbacks last season. They all came in that Week 18 game that you just talked about. And it gave him enough confidence to go with the former 5th-round pick as QB1 for the 2023 season. Now, there's a small chance they roll with Jacoby Brissett for the Week 1 starter, but I think either way, we have to consider this one of the worst quarterback situations in the league. And you have to think this team would have been a buyer for a quarterback with more upside, maybe like Trey Lance or even Jameis Winston, if there wasn't so much turbulence with the ownership group this offseason. It feels like Ron Rivera could be coaching for his job with new owner Josh Harris, and I'm surprised he didn't want to make a move at quarterback because of the rest of this roster seems pretty solid.
Yeah, not bringing in a QB, Rivera must be pretty confident in he and Jack Del Rio's defense.
Yeah, well, Washington has used a ton of draft capital on this defense. They actually used 4 consecutive first-round picks from 2017 to 2020 on the defensive line, and now all of them are in their prime. So this is clearly one of the best defensive lines in the NFL. Jonathan Allen and Daron Payne both finished top 10 in pressures among interior defenders a season ago, and Montez Sweat finished 13th in pass rushing efficiency among edge defenders. And theoretically, they should finally be able to cash in on that draft capital they spent on Chase Young. I mean, he was the 2nd overall pick in 2020, and he's been out for basically the last year and a half outside of 114 snaps at the end of last season. So if Young can finally be healthy and play to his potential, this defensive line is nasty.
Yeah, and do you think the linebacker room's done enough to replace Holcomb?
Well, they replaced Holcomb with Cody Barton, which I think is a minor downgrade. I mean, they'll hope to improve at linebacker. They'll hope that 2021 first round pick Jamin Davis can make another leap after we saw him go from awful to passable in year 1 to year 2. So if he can go from passable to average in year 2 to year 3, this linebacking group will improve just by player development.
Yeah, and we've seen them using some high draft capital on corners lately. Do you like the secondary?
Yeah, so the Commanders used their first and second round picks on cornerbacks Emmanuel Forbes and Jartavius Martin, and both have a chance to start right away alongside cornerback Kendall Fuller, who ranked 16th in PFF coverage grade last year. And if either Forbes or Martin isn't good, then they do have Benjamin St. Juste that gives them a floor in case one of those rookies turns out to be awful. And then at safety, they have Cameron Curl and Derek Forrest, who are both top 25 at that position in my mind. So Washington's secondary is about league average.
Yeah, and moving over to this offense, what can we expect with Bieniemy there now?
Well, Bieniemy comes over from offensive coordinator in Kansas City for the past 5 seasons, and I think many expect him to want to air it out and throw it like we saw the Chiefs do with Patrick Mahomes these past 5 years. But Bieniemy is a former running back and a former running backs coach, and I think Andy Reid was actually the one that was driving all of that passing. And I think Bieniemy could try and pound the rock with his weakness at quarterback this season and a defensive head coach in his ear.
Do you think their running backs are strong enough here to just pound the rock?
Well, they've got 2 running backs that can absorb a ton of touches in Brian Robinson and Antonio Gibson. So I think that those guys, I mean, as long as Washington's defense can keep them in games, I think that Robinson and Gibson can give them 35 carries a game.
Yeah, and we see this offensive line is going to be a lot different this year. What are your thoughts on them?
Well, the Commanders are going to have an entirely new interior offensive line from week 1 of last season. So I would say that Chris Paul and Nick Gates are clearly below average. Sam Cosmi was all right at tackle last season, so he has a chance to be even better at right guard. But Andrew Wiley follows Eric Bieniemy from the Chiefs, and he ranked 6th worst in pass blocking efficiency as Kansas City's right tackle last year. So I'm not super excited about what they're going to get from him in 2023. However, we can expect left tackle Charles Leno to be solid per usual, but this offensive line still looks clearly below average to me.
Well, the good news for them is they've got a couple studs in this receiving room. What are your thoughts on these guys?
Well, it's been pretty remarkable to see Terry McLaurin average nearly 2 yards per route run during his first 4 years in the NFL, given those quarterbacks that have been throwing him the ball. I mean, it's reminiscent of DeAndre Hopkins during those years in Houston before they drafted Deshaun Watson when he was producing season after season with TJ Yates and Brock Osweiler throwing him the ball. But it's not just McLaurin. I mean, many are expecting second-year receiver Jahan Dotson to make a leap after the first-round pick showed flashes last year as a rookie. And Curtis Samuel finished 19th in yards per route run in 2020 when he was in Carolina. And you could make a case that quarterback play has just been holding him down since he got to Washington. So if all of these guys play to their potential, this really has a chance to be one of the best receiving trios in the NFC.
So, what are your overall thoughts on the Commanders for 2023?
Well, if Sam Howell is competent, which is not a guarantee, but if he is competent and Dotson and Chase Young play to their potentials, this team could easily be power rated above average and compete for a playoff spot. However, that seems iffy to me, and it's probably more likely that they finish bottom of the toughest division in the NFC. So the market is going to start the Commanders about 1.5 points worse than average, implying that if they were in the NFC South, they'd be right there as co-favorites with the Saints. But they're not. They're in the NFC East, and I don't think this team would be afraid to fire Ron Rivera if they lose a lot of those games early to tank down the stretch. We saw Josh Harris be the owner during the trust the process 76ers era before the league stepped in, RIP Sam Hinkie. And there's huge prizes at the top of next year's draft with Caleb Williams and Drake May. So if it goes poorly, I could see Ron Rivera in the mix for first coach fired and the Commanders really wanting to tank for one of those QB prizes at the top of next year's draft.
All right, I think that will do it for our NFC East preview. We have now finished all 32 teams, so we're going to be moving on to our fantasy football episode. So next Wednesday, we're going to have our quarterbacks and running backs, and on Friday, we're going to do wide receivers and tight ends. So we already have a bunch of questions lined up, but if you want us to answer your question, just leave it down in the comments.